Now, Labour unrest over Keir Starmer's position on the war in Gaza rolls into yet another week, with frontbencher Imran Hussein resigning in order to be free to call for a ceasefire. Some people argue that Starmer's position is moot on a practical level because he has no power to influence the UK government, let alone the Israelis. Others respond that it's not just a question of principle, it's an indication of how he would act in number 10. We've talked in recent weeks about the specific issue of a ceasefire, but this raises the question of how much it is reasonable to expect from a Prime Minister in waiting. If Stanley Baldwin famously accused newspaper proprietors of seeking power without responsibility, does an opposition leader headed for victory have responsibility without power? Hannah, it sometimes feels like Starmer is under more scrutiny on this issue than the actual Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And obviously part of that reason is that Palestine is a major issue for the Labour Party. But is he also being assessed more and more as the next Prime Minister rather than just an opposition leader?
I think it's the combination of those together. So, yes, it is about this leader in waiting type persona that he's now got to build. How will he act on the world stage? Is it? It's a shadow of what we want to see in the future. Plus, also, is he acting as a kind of an effective opposition now? Do we feel like he's becoming the sort of person who can challenge a general election? But it is also about the Labour Party and what it is, as you hinted at. Palestine's a massive issue. Obviously, the Corbyn shadow of anti-Semitism. It's all playing out now. And it's not just about his world stage figure. It's what sort of Prime Minister could he be? Has he moved sufficiently beyond that? And some see what they want in him now. Some see what they don't want. And there's no real way for him to get beyond that other than to just pick his channel and stick to it in a very sensible, calm way, and that's what he's done. And of course there'll be a large faction of the Labour Party support that doesn't like the version of Starmer they're seeing now. But I think his comfort with that discomfort is actually stands him in good stead.
Matt, hopefully Netanyahu won't be in power for much longer. He's incredibly unpopular for having fucked up.
Although people have been saying that about Netanyahu for years.
I've personally been saying that. But yeah, I mean, things are looking quite bad for him. But PM Starmer, if that happens, will have to deal with one Israeli Prime Minister or another. So do you think that part of his calculation versus, for example, if this crisis had erupted 3 years ago, when Labour was basically considered like a decade from power, do you think he's aware that whatever he says now might be quoted back to him by Israel like a year down the line? That it's a different consideration the closer you get.
Yes, I think probably that is part of it. I don't know how much influence the British Prime Minister even has on Israel these days, especially the current very right-wing Likud plus really right-wing other parties. I think none. Yeah, I mean, almost the opposite. I think almost it might be seen as almost a badge of honour to be resisting what Britain says. I suspect this whole thing is probably much more about trying to stay on side with the American position, to not be too far away from what Biden is suggesting. David Lammy's been quite strong in recent days. Written an article in The Observer over the weekend urging Israel to stop the violence in the West Bank, to prevent the siege conditions in Gaza, stressing the international law aspect, stressing that Israel has to be very careful about how it targets and things, and emphasising also that Labour would work for a two-state solution. So I think they do have quite a strong position on it, which a lot of people, certainly on the right of Israel, and there is a lot of people on the right of Israel in politics in Israel at the moment, they would hate that. So I think, in a sense, whatever Keir Starmer says, I don't think anyone in Israel in that part of the governing party will care.
Well, people who think that Starmer is showing sort of undiluted support for Israel should talk to some of the people who show undiluted support for Israel and find that they consider this disgracefully wishy-washy.
Yeah, I mean, the comparison that slightly struck me just then is that it's almost a bit like the BBC, that whenever anyone asks, I mean, this issue is a good example of it. Whenever people say anything about the BBC, it's always like they're incredibly pro-Israel, they're incredibly pro-Palestine, or they're pro-Hamas, or they're pro-Likud, or whatever. And it's always somewhere in the middle. And yes, on any given day, there'll be some reports and some people who go one way or the other. But in general, they're probably they're trying to find an incredibly difficult middle ground. Whether they're successful or not is, a moot, who knows. But I think that's probably where Starmer is a little bit at the moment as well.
Jeremy Corbyn's main obsession was foreign policy. I think he was far more interested in that than in domestic policy. So I think, love it or hate it, I suppose you could say that you knew what his foreign policy was, even though Labour's official foreign policy was somewhat diluted version. Do you understand what Labour's foreign policy philosophy is right now? Like when you look at Starmer, when you look at Lammy, like do you understand what is there a clear agenda, a clear sense of how they would act?
I don't know if I'd say it's a very clear sense or a clear agenda. I think David Lammy has made some pronouncements in the last year or so as Shadow Foreign Secretary. He's said that new ties with the EU would be Labour's top priority, and that's very positive. Obviously, that's before the Israel-Palestine situation sort of blew up again. He's also been talking a lot about climate justice, about linking up with other people across the world on that, global anti-corruption. And generally, I think if you could sum up in a sentence, it's trying to rejoin the global community a bit, try to make the UK feel less like a pariah as it has in the last few years, and not a country that's sort of smashing up agreements and going off on its own and just trying to sort of going screw you to its neighbours and friends, trying to be a little bit like, I guess, Biden did after Trump. And he said something literally like, we're rejoining the world's stage or something. And I suspect that's what Labour were hoping to do. Now, I think obviously the Israel situation has made that much more fraught. I think obviously everyone would hope that none of this had happened, but I suspect Labour particularly thinking, we would have been able to have a much clearer, Europe is our focus, then global strategies on climate, and now obviously all eyes are on there, and that's very difficult for them.
Well, it's a no-win. Wherever you stand on that, politically it is a no-win.
Sure.
Robert, Corbynites see Corbyn's foreign policy positions as sort of the true heart of Labour. But have Labour governments always had a more pragmatic or even sometimes like hawkish foreign policy? Going back to, I suppose, Ernest Bevin being a key example.
Yes, there's always been a more kind of hard-nosed version of Labour foreign policy. Labour is integral to the creation of NATO. It's a Labour government that builds the nuclear bomb. You mentioned Ernest Bevin. There's a famous scene in the Labour Party conference in 1935 when Labour actually had a pacifist leader, George Lansbury, and he's taken down by Bevin, who accuses him of hawking his conscience around the conference and looking for someone to tell him what to do with it. But alongside that, Labour always tends to think quite moralistically about foreign policy. So there's a kind of small c tradition of foreign policy, which says it's about British interests, it's about statecraft, it's about realpolitik. Now, not all Conservatives think about foreign policy in that way. It's really hard for Labour to think about foreign policy in that way because its MPs and its activists in particular really want to see foreign policy as a kind of arena of great moral causes and a place, where you stand by the powerless. You're about to jump in.
Sorry. No.
So that's always been there. And I think it's, in many ways, that's a really admirable impulse. I would want governments to think about foreign policy in that way, but it does make it much more flammable. So it means that something like Vietnam is much harder for the Labour Party than it is for the Conservative Party. Iraq is much harder for Labour, and not just because it's in power. And an issue like this one, where the kind of moral lines are so entangled, could almost have been kind of grown in a laboratory, I think, to play to Labour's neuroses and difficulties around foreign affairs.
Was Wilson's refusal to join Lyndon Johnson's war in Vietnam, what guided that decision? Because that was often brought up when Blair seemed to be going along with Bush. Now, I see that as actually that was Blair's own moral crusade, which was misguided, but it was a lot more than just going, I'll do whatever America does. But to put that to one side, it was brought up, it's like, we didn't follow America into Vietnam. Was that a case of Wilson being extremely moral because he thought it was a bad war, or was it pragmatic?
Well, what's interesting there is that since the Iraq War, we say Wilson refused to join the Vietnam War, and that makes him in some ways popular on the left. At the time, the story is Wilson refuses to condemn the Vietnam War, which makes him rather a villain for the left. Wilson was in a really difficult situation at that point because, on the one hand, his party, his activists, much of his country was really strongly opposed to what was happening at Vietnam. But on the other hand, he's coming under colossal pressure from President Johnson to send, he says, even a troop of bagpipers, some kind of symbolic support. And this is a country on which Britain was very dependent economically and diplomatically. So Wilson walks a kind of tightrope in which he won't support the war, he won't send the bagpipers, but he also won't condemn it either. And that did him tremendous damage at the time. Famous, we've been thinking about the Beatles this week with their last single. John Lennon sends his MBE back to the palace in 1969 in protest at, as he puts it, Harold Wilson's support for the Vietnam War. So it's interesting how Iraq has changed the way that we remember what Wilson did on Vietnam.
We missed out on a very good Vietnam War movie about bagpipers.
There's still time.
Platoon. Come on.